A warm welcome to everyone. Today the topic that we are going to cover is remote compliant TDLs. So starting with the understanding of the architecture that we follow, the Tally client server architecture is used for TallyNet, and it is to provide a number of services to Tally.ERP 9 users. And it is basically a client server architecture that this TallyNet feature is following. So this is how basically you can interpret about the TallyNet server. It helps you to do routing of services, synchronization, manage your license, remote user authentication, auditor addition. So there are n number of services that this TallyNet provides. So before we go ahead understanding the concept of developing a remote compliant TDL, the first thing that we need to understand is how to enable a company for remote, right? So we'll just start with one basic feature on enabling a company for remote. And to avail the service for a company to execute as a remote, you need to have a TallyNet service, right? So we'll just start with one basic application part. This is a Tally where we have a license. We are selecting a company called ABC. Any company to be connected at the remote, first it has to have a security username and password enabled. In the scenario or the case where the company does not have a username and password, you need to ensure that the username and password is enabled. So how do we make this change? Alt F3, alter company name, use security control, enable it, set it to yes, provide an administrator username and password, the repeat password, and accept this. Please note, the security control has to be enabled for any company to get connected through remote. Then at the system where the data is available, we will also have to provide certain company details. So at F11, TallyNet features, the connect name of the company can be provided, the contact person, the contact number. Allow this company to get connected to remote? Yes. Only when this option is set to yes, on the main screen, on the gateway of Tally, you will see a button called connect. Connect company on load. The moment you start your company, it will automatically get connected. Suggested is not to get connected, as it would not, and then the moment you try to connect and internet is not available, it will take time to load as it is trying to verify for an internet connection. So it is preferable to set to no until unless the company always has to get connected and we will only have remote users, or we will always have remote users. Then whether this company should be enabled for SMS or not, again this is dependent on the company utility. Accepted. Now the important feature, we need a user that can get connected to a that can be connected from a remote system to our company. This user has to be entered at the security control. So Alt F3, security control. The type of security has to be a TallyNet user, which any group user for which you have said use TallyNet authentication. This has to be enabled, and this is where it will allow your user to get connected at the remote login. Users and password. Here is the user, TallyNet user, username, and allow remote access, yes. This has to be set to yes. Please note the username has to be a valid user email ID, as a password to access a remote login user will be sent to this user ID, right? So this email ID has to be a valid email ID. The moment you accept this screen, it will send a password to this particular email ID. So whenever the user, this particular user needs to get connected to this company, has to use the username that you have provided here and the password sent to the email ID, right? And we will accept this. Done. And here we have the button F4. You click here, it says F4 connect. The C symbol shows that the report is connected. Clear? The C symbol shows that the company is connected, and you can see the details here. Now we have opened another instance of Tally, assuming that this particular Tally application is installed on a faraway remote system where internet connection is available but does not have a license number, does not have a license. Here we will click on login as a remote Tallynet user. Here I will provide my username and password. You see, I have a company which is connected right now, and it is providing me the details. Do you see, it is also showing me a serial number. Select the company. If it has multiple users, it will give you the list of users. Select your user, and your company is connected through user, and you will be able to see that we have the remote details. My remote ID is this, the last time it was logged in, the last login duration and time, and the company name and the connect name of this company. You see, by looking at this, you will understand that there's a change in this, because probably some of the part of the details have not been enabled specifically for this particular Tallynet user, right? So this is a basic concept of logging connected to the remote user. Wondering why I spoke about this? Is simple. A quick recap of how to enable it. Obviously you should know the product, right? So going back to the presentation that we are following right now, what we were talking about is the remote user So discussing about the remote user, we will understand the remote capabilities of TDL we require. Why would we require a TDL capability for remote? One simple thing, all Tally users do not use the functionality of remote. There are certain users using it, there are certain users not using the remote capability. Hence, all the report that we create in TDL aren't made capable enough to connect to get remote. Only when a customer requires it is when we have to make it to we have to enable it for remote. Not necessary whether the customer might need or not need. It is always important to understand the concept when, how would a report or a TDL that has been created by you will work at a remote, or the reasons of the failures that it is not working at the remote. Fair enough? Quite reasonable to understand why we are learning this, right? So the capabilities that we have done, the artifacts that we have changed to ensure that everything works at the remote capabilities, we have made changes at field, form, report, collection, behavior of the functions, and an action has been introduced. So these are the artifacts where we have done coding level changes which you will have to ensure that you do it so that it gives you an output at the remote. On the other side also ensures you to give some performance improvements. So starting with the field. So an object can be fetched at the field level when method of an object is required on value selected. The attribute we have is fetch object. There are some examples that we can take here. For an example, this is our sales voucher F12, and here we say common ledger allocation, yes, right. Now I select my party name. By default what happens is we'll just this is my current local system, the local tally where data exists physically. Accounting vouchers, F8 payment, F8 sales. I select my party name and I select my sales ledger, and we will allow user to select VAT tax class, right. So say if I have cash sales where the VAT isn't enabled at all. This is the particular ledger where I haven't enabled VAT, right. So if the VAT is not enabled for this, it does not make sense to even place my cursor to my VAT tax class. And if VAT is enabled, then only it makes sense to call this table, right. Similarly, when we go at a remote and say here we select my sales ledger as my cash sales. So what should happen? The table that we have at VAT tax class should not get fetched at all, because it wouldn't make sense to fetch the table. So we skip fetching that. However, if we have a VAT tax class enabled for that particular ledger, and we have allowed a selection for the VAT tax class, then only this particular table should get fetched, right. So based on the selection of the value that we have at the field, the object tax classification should get fetched. Now for an example, this is specifically for VAT tax class. So only if a ledger was enabled for VAT tax class, this particular table should get fetched. If it is not there, does it make sense to call this table? Obviously not, correct? So this is where the field level fetch object comes into picture, that based on the current field value, you can fetch the subsequent objects. If you don't require, you might just skip calling that particular object. Similarly, at form level, you can fetch multiple objects where you in a report there are multiple forms that are getting created. So there is a possibility that for one form you require a different object, for another form you require a different object. So at each form you can specify the required object that you need, and then the subsequent part and lines will get inherited from, and you will be able to use values from those selected fetched objects. So a report A may have form 1 and form 2. Say at form 1 you are trying to get all the ledgers, and at form 2 you want only the bill allocations of that respective ledgers. So these are two different objects. So based on what you require, one fetch object can be of ledger, second fetch object can be of bill allocations. So based on what kind of objects you would like to call at each form, you can have various you can have various fetch objects specified at form level. And then at report level, again, there are objects that can be fetched at report level itself. For an example, if the report is a object specific report, for example voucher, then you can call the voucher itself, right? So similarly, we have various attributes. We have fetch object, we have prefetch object, we have fetch values, and multi objects that we can use. There is another attribute called fetch collection to fetch the collection at the reports level, right? So depending upon the utility that we have, we would be using each attribute. Again, all attributes are not mandatory to be used. Depending upon your requirement, you would be using each of these attributes. So before we go through the understanding, or before we actually use these attributes, let us just understand what this attribute does, what is the syntax, and then we'll go to the examples of these attributes that are specified here. So there is an attribute called fetch object, in which you need to specify the object that you need, which can be an expression. It has to be an object. You need to specify an object type. Then you can have multiple objects of that particular type to be called. So you have fetch object, the object type, the object name, and the methods that you need to fetch. So this particular attribute is available at report, form, field, and function, the user defined functions. So this particular attribute will also be getting covered in your chapter TDL procedural capabilities. Now talking about fetch object, the syntax goes as fetch object, object type, so this could be any primary object type, expression. Now there is a possibility that you would like to call multiple objects of a particular type and its methods. For example, in a multi-display report of stock item, you want to call all the items. It's a multi-report, right? So you want all these stock items. So it's an expression. Now, for specifically separating a comma is not an expression that can be understood as a part of the fetch object expression list. So this is how we have showcased it. Currently, the example that we have shown is calling a single object value. That is hash ledger name, a value of a ledger is getting pushed, and we are calling the name, parent, and closing balance. Now when you talk about say at the reports level, my object is voucher, and I would like to call the inventory entries of this particular object voucher. Then how do we call? Say I need the closing balance of all the stock items that I am having in this particular voucher. How do we call it? So to call that entire list of my stock items is where we will require this particular function called fetch separator. So fetch separator is similar to what we have as $full list. What does a full list do is it does a comma separation between the values that we have, correct? Here fetch separator is a special character, a separator character, which helps us to provide, or which helps us to give a separation between two objects. So for this, to give an identification that this is an object one identifier, fetch the separator character and this is object identifier 2. The fetch separator function helps us to do this, bring this separator character. So let me just show you one example of this fetch separator. So this is where we have an example of fetch separator. All the TDLs showcased in these in this session, we have provided the sample TDLs available. So here is an example that we have used. So let us just check this. Here, fetch object, stock item, all the stock items, and whatever the stock items we need parent and the last sale price, and which are these items? All the items selected in this collection. So the collection is of data source parent report. Selected lines, we need the name, parent, and the last sale price. So let us just check this. It is in release 2.0 enhancements for remoting fetch separator. .0 for remoting fetch separator. Here we will select few stock items and I click on this button. Please understand, at remote there is no data object available, there is no data context available. There is this particular report basically is now just an XML that you are viewing in your remote system. This is a remote system where we are right now viewing the data. So there is basically, it's just a mirror image of the data. So right now we do not have any data context. So to get a data context or to get the values that we need, this is fetch object. Now just let me show you a small change here. I go to this particular report and we just remove the fetch object. We don't have a fetch object. Now see the output. Well, we'll just have to log out. Refresh the TDL here first. F12 TDL F4. This is the server side of my company data getting refreshing my TDL. This is the TDL that we have. This is my server side data exists, so I don't have a problem at all. Now going to my client side. Just refetching all my data. Yeah, my data does not exist. The simple reason, the objects that I need are not fetched. You see the difference? Server does not have a problem displaying the data because it has the data context available. But the moment I go into the remote client, it loses the data context, and when you don't fetch the objects that you require, it does not call the values. So You need it, but you don't call it, will not serve the purpose. You need it, you have to call the values. So simple, and I do this. Now, the important thing that we need to know is there are multiple lines selected. So there are multiple stock item values data that I need to fetch. So that is the reason why we really need a collection. So this function $full list ex allows me to provide me my separator of the collection list. Like by default $full list, when you call, the separator is always a comma. So to give your own separator, we have a function called $full list ex. So the parameters are the special character you need, the collection name, and the method name. So this is the entire syntax of this function. Separator character, fetch separator is a function that retrieves a separator character. Well, we cannot see the separator character. It is encoded. It's an encoding text character, something like an L shape on the top. So basically it's a Unicode character. So basically whatever values we have in this collection, or the number of objects we have in this collection, is separated by that, and this is what my fetch object at this level can identify, which can be a system formula also. This is how the fetch object works. Well, this is not only at the reports level. The same syntax can be at the form level, can be at the field level, can be at the function level, depending upon the requirement of your report. Right? Everybody clear with this? Great. So this is what fetch separator helps me to do. Then we have a very specific character, a specific attribute called fetch prefetch object. Now we just did a fetch object. So why would I require a prefetch object when my entire task, my object can be fetched with the help of a fetch object? Why would I use a prefetch object in any case? Okay, let me just give you one simple example. You have 15,000 ledgers. It is not necessary for every party you pass a transaction every day. Correct? There could be certain parties for whom you might have passed entries, say just 2 months ago, or for some parties you might have passed entries, say just 10 days ago, or for some you have passed it today. So you exactly do not know the last date of entry. In scenarios where I am at my server, no problem at all. I mean, I can just set my variable values, and set attribute can be used to change, change the variable values that I need, and then I can just call the data. Like for example, all my ledgers have the last date stored, last date of entry that we have passed an entry for a particular ledger. So at my server, simple thing that we can do is, report level, there is an attribute called set. I will change my SV from date and to date to the last date of entry of my ledger that I have selected. Right? So this is one simple example that we have here. Here So what we have done is a simple thing that we have done. First we select a ledger. So this is my current system, my server end. remote compliant TDLs, prefetch object. I select a ledger and the last date of entry is 31st December 2010, whereas my current date is 3rd Feb 2015. The last date of entry is 31st December 2010, and okay, for this particular party also my last date of entry is 31st December 2010. Well, we'll just pass one entry today on current date. VF8, and we'll change this date to 2011, and I will not select this. So my last date of entry is 2nd Feb 2011. However, as per the ledger ABC India Limited, my last date of entry is 31st December 2010. So what happens here is, as far as the server is concerned, it does not have a problem at all, because when I'm at my server end, my data is locally available. It simply fetches the data from my local system. That is what it does. Right? So that is what it does. It simply calls the data. But even at my server, and I can just do a hit and trial of pressing F2 and change the dates and get the data. Now this is where we typically face a problem is, now when the same report has to go at the remote side, first I select the ledger, and then we find out that on the last date of entry that this report is fetching me, it does not have the data at all. See, Alt F2, when I enter here, my last date of entry is Feb 2011. It does not have a data at all. I again change my period to check when it has the data, and this is when actually it fetches my data. This request, the number of requests that goes and comes back, it keeps sending a request to the server side for the collection based on the dates you passed it to fetch the value. So based on the last date of voucher of this particular report, now based on my last date of entry for my ABC company, for my ledger ABC India Private Limited, I want this report to get generated. So what is the last date of entry for this particular ledger? Absolutely right, 31st December 2010. So what do? Before we set this SV from date to date, forget about even the from date, my to date is very important here right now, because my last date of entry for ABC Private Limited is 31st December. If my SV to date or my SV from date is my current date, I will have no data. So before even this variable value SV from date 2 gets set, first thing that I want to do is go to my ledger object ABC Private Limited, get the last date of entry method, push this into my variable SV from date to date, and then get my collection fetch object or my fetch collection. This is how this entire reporting or this entire syntax works. Very simple, isn't very complicated. So as per the precedence hierarchy, prefetch object, then the set, and then the objects get fetch. So just let me show you this particular code in Tally developer. Here is where we have a prefetch object code. Again, all these sample codes are available here. Help, TDL samples. You do not have to worry about it. Just scrolling down a bit. Here, this is my trigger report. In this trigger report, there is a variable called ledger name. This is what is selected, and this is my report that gets opened. In this report, which is going to get opened as my final report, we have a prefetch object. So before even you start generating this particular report, go to the ledger object. This is the ledger name. Get me the last date of voucher. Set this last date of voucher for each my from date and to date, and then fetch the object of this ledger. Well, this is one example which we have done. Based on this, we have called all your other reports where my parts will, based on, obviously this is where my collection will get modified on my SV from date and to date, right? So this is how it works. So the first thing that happens is my fetch object comes into existence, then my SV from date, my SV to date, and then the object gets fetched. So now one more thing that could have been done here is, we knew that fetch object is the title, the top panel that we have. This top panel is for my fetch object, right? Now obviously the lines are going to get repeated on another, this line is getting repeated on some collection which we are aware of, right? There will be a line on which it is getting repeated. So the moment you know that this collection is going to be called, what will happen when you say now the report is constructed? While it is trying to throw off the interface at your remote, it identifies that there is another collection that you need to call. There is a collection that you need to call for the repeat line. So what happens? Again, there is a request which goes to the server to get the collection. Why? Because you haven't stated earlier to get the collection name. It's completely robotic, right? It's not verbal that it does a task at one job. You have to tell, okay, you fetch the object for me, you fetch this collection for me. What will happen is, the moment it checks at the repeat line, there is a collection that is available. This collection is not available at the remote. Obviously, there is no data context available, there is no data available. It again triggers another request to the server, fires a statement, please, it's a request, give me the collection for my line to get repeated. So second request is going, it fetches the collections and comes back, right? So to avoid going for the second request of the collection, at this particular report itself, I could simply write fetch collection, and the collection name will be the collection which we are using at my repeats line. So at one shot, the object is fetched, pre-fetched, values are set object is done, object that you require at the banner is called, and the collection that you need at the repeat line is called at the reports level itself. So entire data is in one shot is called. So you don't have to have worries about, if you don't mention, what is going to happen is, it is not that the data won't come. The only problem is that it will go for a second time request. Now what will happen when you have multiple objects and multiple collections? Every time it will go back to the server to call the values. Please give me the value. Please give me the value. So to ensure that the number of requests that you send to the server is minimized. Obviously, at certain given point of time, you might not know what is the collection that will come to you. You cannot fetch it. For an example where we just spoke about a data source, we will not know that this collection will be called, right? So there you cannot do a fetch collection. But when it is a known collection that your line is going to get repeated on that collection, a fetch collection is always better to be specified. So the number of requests that you send to the server reduces. Now talking about fetch values, again these are the list of values or methods that you need. Now the object context of the report can be different from the objects that you are fetching at the report level. Ouch. I mean, how is it possible? Why not? There is a possibility that the entire report goes on a different context of the object. The entire report object context can be different, and you need to fetch values of different objects. For an very simple example of our voucher object, the report context of the object of that voucher is object. That's the base. However, there are other objects that you are calling there, like your ledger object to get the current balance. Now that is also a fetch object that we have written, so that you get the current balance of your ledger, that party you have selected. So a fetch object the fetch object might not get directly related to the current object context. So fetch values allows us to call the method names that are currently available in the current object context of the report. So if my current object context is tax classification, fetch values, and you can provide the method names available in that particular object. So you can say method 1, comma method 2, comma method 3, comma method 4. You can give the list of methods that you need. Now we have an attribute called multi-objects. This attribute is again used at report levels. However, this attribute is required in an edit mode of a report, maybe a create report and an alter report. But why would we require this? Until now, whatever discussions we have made is talking about calling the values first, right? All the values are being called. Until now, whatever we have talked about is the calling of values, showing them, how to show them, where to, when to. Now this is when you have to call the values. Now when these values have to get modified, as I have been repeatedly mentioning, that object context is not available. In cases where report has multiple collections or multiple objects available, how does the remote system know which method or which collection do you want to modify? It does not know, because there's a possibility that you might have multiple collections. You might not even have, but you might also have possibility. How does a remote system know about it that you are going to modify a collection? Which collection? So multi-objects attribute at report level can be used for reports in alter mode to specify the collection that you want to modify. And this is used in scenarios where we are talking about multi-ledger alteration or multi-group alteration or a multi-stock item alteration. So this attribute is used at that particular level, where it allows you to specify a primary collection, a collection of primary objects which you can modify, and that is what gets pushed back to your server. In case you don't specify this, there is no error, but the values won't get updated at the server. So it's a simple action, it's a simple attribute, multi-objects and the collection name. Simple. Now talking about the collection artifact, Tally client has to fetch the required objects from the remote server whenever the collection is used. Tally client, see, very simple thing is, there's a possibility that you need to call an object, but you might not require the entire object structure, because you might require only certain of them, and calling all of them makes your it becomes very costly in terms of network bandwidth. Now, if you look at I'll show you the simplest object structure that is possible. This is the schema. This is the batch. Even at the batch level, you can see the number of methods that are available. Even this is simplest object that we can talk about. Now, when this entire structure gets actually transmitted to your remote via an XML, it will be a huge chunk, because you might have 15,000 stock items, and each 15,000 stock item might have at least 15 batches. So 15,000 into 15, so that would be the number of structures of this batch that gets generated, which gets transmitted to your remote. And along with that, these 50 methods get carried away. So 15,000 into 15 into this 25 or 50 method names, or rather. So 15,000 into 15 into 5050 actually is a huge chunk of data. And you might just require two things: the name of the batch and the closing balance. Does it make sense to fetch all these things at your remote? No, because it becomes pretty expensive. In terms of network bandwidth, it's pretty expensive. So to fetch the required methods that we want of an object, we have an attribute called fetch at collection level. So in addition to fetch methods that we'll be doing for aggregation, we also have aggregate compute and compute that can be, so only those computed and aggregate computed methods will be called at my remote. So when you look into the structure of a collection, there is a data source that we have. The data is gathered, filtered, sorted. We make union of that collection. We can perform aggregation, extraction, search for the required values, and then showcase the values that we need. So this is how the aggregation feature of collection works like. First, we have a source collection. So what is the base of a collection? Type voucher. Great. Now we create a summary collection. The source of the summary collection is my object voucher. That's the voucher collection. Then we walk to the inventory entries. Group on the stock item name. So the stock item name does not repeat multiple times, it just comes once. Aggregate compute on the build quantity. So whatever the summation of the quantities that we have for this stock item gets calculated here. So only the specific things like the stock item name and build QTY, that is what gets carried forward to my voucher. Then we have the collection attributes. This is a sample of the attributes that get supported at my remote. Obviously, this also works in the server side, but more important at this client side, because what you fetch here, what you walk here, you do a buy, you do a compute, you do an aggregate compute, only that data traverses to the remote. The moment that is not mentioned here, it gets cut off from the remote. It might appear at your server end because the data is physically available there, but at remote it won't be available. There are two other attributes like the client only and the firmware that we have, which we'll see in the later slides. Why the summarization is required, why this data roll-up? The first benefit it does is the large collections that we have. So I have 25,000 vouchers, the entire scanning is done in one shot. And on the moment I write type voucher, the number of lines encountering it keeps traversing back, scans it, brings the data, scans it, brings the data. So it takes a hell lot of time. So it just, in one shot just scans up everything and does the aggregation, and then output is given. So the large data is summarized to get a large story. When you want to buy a book, obviously you cannot read the entire book. So what do we do is we quickly go through the summary of the book. So that's a faster way. So same way with the summarization or the data roll-up works like. Then the overall effect is reduction in TDL code complexity. Obviously, the number of functions to get to do the summation, call QTY total and call AMT total, those gets reduced. So all those functions to call multiple objects from here and there and do a modification of an object is vanished. And obviously, the moment the code complexity reduces, you give less pressure to the brains of your system, your data, it speeds up. So it becomes faster, robust, more scalable solution, and you can deliver more data and more code in less time, and it becomes quite maintainable. The data becomes very maintainable. So the attribute fetch, simple, comma separated list. We have already done this attribute when we are discussing about the chapter objects and collections. You can refer to that particular recording once again. Along with that, one thing that we can specify in detail, we have a wild character, wildcards, like the question mark and asterisk. Why would we require a wildcard? How does it make sense of having it? In default Tally, if you look, the reports that Tally has is working as it is in the remote. For now, as I showed you, we have the simplest object that we have batch has 50 method names. Now, obviously, not today I keep writing the method name. Tomorrow, a new method is added to it. I will have to explicitly specify it, which becomes very difficult. So, wildcards helps me to do that. Now, how does it help me? The moment I mention asterisk, it fetches all the methods in that particular object along with the collection of the current object. So if you look at the object voucher and I say object voucher asterisk, if the moment we give asterisk, it will fetch all the methods of the voucher along with the collection. So voucher has two main collections, ledger entries and inventory entries. So these two collections are fetched. And if I want further, we can give a comma separated values to that. Talking about question mark, only the methods are called. So whatever methods we have, date, narration, voucher type name and those ledger name and things is what is called. It does not call the sub collections. Ledger entries, inventory entries aren't called. So it will be called only when you need it. So full path you can specify like a method formula syntax. So this is one simple example. Fetches all the methods and the sub collection bill allocation of ledger entries, and here only the methods of inventory entries are fetched. Now with the new capability of the walk inventory entries in single step process, this is how in my remote my voucher date, narration, party name, item name and the billed quantity gets displayed in a single scan. We don't have to worry about again going back, calling the ledger name, mapping it with the item name and then calling it. No, it will happen at a single scan. And this collection can be simply fetched. Attribute client only. This particular attribute collects data from a collection available at remote. We just talked about that remote does not have a data at all. Then from what does it collect the data from? This attribute collects the data from a collection available at the remote. But when there is no data at a remote, what data is it trying to collect? Let us just give one small example of this. Before we go to the example, let's just have a small look with the syntax. Client only just looks for a logical value, so it's a yes or a no. A collection which is like an ODBC. So say you create a collection to call an Excel value. Where is this Excel available? Obviously not on your server. It is there on the client system. The Excel sheet is available on your client system. So now the moment you do not by default it is client only no. So what does it do is it tries to go to your server. Your whatever you have specified, it tries to locate that particular data. Now when that data does not exist in your server, right, the request that you get is empty. So to ensure that the collection that you have gets gathered at your remote location itself, we write client only yes. So let's take an example that we just did some time back, where we were talking about fetch separator. Here the data source report is discussed. Now where is this parent report? Just take an example that this hasn't been specified here. What happens is, the moment this particular attribute is not encountered, the collection that it is looking out for is data source, parent line, parent report, selected lines. So when it comes to your server, no problem. Now when it comes to your client, what happens here? The moment it sees it's a collection, it triggers back to your server. Now at server, this is the screen that is available. Where is my parent report? Does not have a parent report. When parent report itself is not available, the scope selected line does not exist, does not make sense. So my collection cannot get gathered here and it fails. Now when we go to this report, and now when we say here, we will have to just log out and get back. I have selected this line. Client only is not specified here. So what does, the moment we click on this report, what happens is the entire data goes back, the parent report selected line comes back to the server. Server does not have it, so back it is empty. Now when I uncomment this, refresh my login as remote user, See, now in this case, my parent report for this report is this, correct? If I don't write client only yes, and the moment I click here, it tries to locate a parent report available here on my server. Now say on my server I am not performing any activity, only the company is connected. For this particular collection, what is the parent report? Nothing. So what will happen at this side? No output. But I have a parent report at my client side. So for the collection to evaluate itself at the client end itself, we have this attribute called client only. So the moment you specify a client only colon yes, the collection tries to gather the it gathers the collection at the client itself. So it does not send a request to the server. By default, the attribute value is no. So we have already seen this particular report, selected lines from a current report. Now this is a very peculiar attribute called palmware of collection. Generally when the collection artifact evaluates the various attributes during the initialization or at the time of the collection gathering, it may require inputs from various requester contexts. Again in the object and collection chapter we have discussed about various functions which does this job, like the as rec obj, as request obj, as req object. So these are the functions that we have discussed about. So based on the need of the collection, the gathering can be based on the requester context. For an example, say in the trial balance, the main repeat line is of type group, and we explored for its ledger. So it's like a child-parent relationship or for filtration. So what happens? These kind of things get basically the gathering of it happens at the time of gathering of the collection. So when you are gathering the collection is when it happens. Now say when we it's an explode, and at child of the collection is type ledger, and at child of you give $name. So the main line is on group exploded part, and in that you have a repeat line on the collection. The $name will get evaluated on the parent, that is the first main part. What happens? It's a requester context. So each time it has to refer to the requester. It might we require the function $rec object colon $name to refer to that name, to refer to that particular group name to get the value. The direct references of these expressions, there's a direct reference you try to call the $name from that particular object. One, code complexity increases, impacts the performances because there will be a repeated filtrations it will have to do, because $name of the requester context. So the number of explores you do, it will keep going into that particular it will keep going to that particular server and fetch the values. So the number of requests between the server and the client will also increase. This is where palmware aids to it. Although it's a variable, the output of this variable basically depends on the requesters that you provide. So whatever value that you provide to this variable, it will assume that it is being called from the requester. It is called from a requester. So the palmware is a context-free element within the collection. So anywhere you call it between the collection, the requester's object context is available for evaluation of its value. So only where whatever you term it as a requester context for this an object is what you can call in the palmware. Once it is this is evaluated only once in the context of the caller or the requester. So once it is called, it does not go for the multiple request on the server. It is called. So once you send the request and the server fetches it, it holds it at the remote level. So the next time again it is called at same report, it holds to the requester context and the value is just flushed out. So it does not go again back to the server, call the value and create a new XML for it. So the moment the collection is gathered, the expression is evaluated and the value is pulled without any problem. So this is how this syntax looks. The syntax looks similar to something called as source-var, compute-var and filter-var, which we have covered in the objects and collections. Palm-var is one typical thing that the formula or the value that gets evaluated, it is the value of the requester context. This is the only difference in the palm-var. So this is one typical example that we have been using for creating various reports. An explode report. It's a simple explode report, list of groups and exploded to its ledgers. A very typical simple example that we have. So what do we do is, we repeat our main line on list of groups. Then in this line we have an exploded part which is repeating on ledgers. Type ledger, child of dollar name. Now this dollar name refers to list of groups, and my collection requester object is this groups because that's my parent line. What happens in the general scenario? The collection SMP list of ledgers, the child of attribute is evaluated based on method name dollar name, which is available in my group object context, the main line that is associated to the group object. In the remote environment, the report is being displayed. The request for the collection gathering goes at the server end. At the server end, the requester context itself is not there. By his report is not open. I am on gateway of Tally, and this collection, when I explode, the ledger is already the collection at my report level is already flushed out. The dollar name does not exist in my remote side. Now when I go to my server, the requester context itself is not there. So what do we do? So dollar name fails. In these kind of situations where the requester context has to be maintained, or the value of a requester context has to be flushed into the collection, palm-var comes into picture. So simple thing we have done, child of # palm led name. This is the name of my variable, string dollar name. Now this dollar name refers to my group object. So this is understood. So the moment this is called, the value for dollar name is flushed from my group that has been made available already. So the gathering, although happens at the server side, it maintains the object context of dollar name that it has into this variable. Function on request, based on the requirement, the behaviors of the functions has been modified, whether it will be on the server side or the client side or both. So there are certain functions that gets evaluated at the client side only, that is $line, $owner, $machine date. All this gets evaluated at the client side. Then we have server side functions like $num ledger, $num journal. Then we have certain functions like calling empty total, is sales. Now it depends whether it has where you have called it. If you have already called it into a collection that exists, then it will get evaluated at the client side. If it does not exist, it will go on the server to get the value and fetch it. So that's a hybrid behavior. Then we have an action called modify object. Modify object can be used to pick up any object and alter the same object in display mode or edit mode. as in the remote there is no data available, all data that we have is XML. So in case there is a particular data to be created or altered, we require modify object, and multiple values of this can be modified by comma separated method values. So this is the syntax: object, absolute or relative object context, and you can specify the methods that you want to provide. Simple. Now some quick steps to make your report remote compliant TDLs. These are just quick steps that will help you to do your job. Whatever we have learned are required, but these are certain quick steps. It's like, you can cook, but some cooking tips. It's like a quick tip to write a remote TDL. Fetching the single object, repeating lines over collection, and using the same collection in more than one report. How are we going to do this? Very simple. When you talk about fetching the single object, to call multiple objects of a report in a report, prefetch object attribute can be used at report level, and this reduces multiple calls for the fetch object fetching the object methods. So somewhere down the report you have the object to be called, and if it's a one typical object that you will require always for this report, fetch it at the report level. If not, then if you don't need it at that report level, based on the value that you have a field level you have to call it, then call it there. Fetching methods, simple at collection level, fetch the method names that you need. Just specify the method names. Even if you are not fetching and still you are getting some values, it is suggested that you fetch. Certain internal methods have been fetched by default. Like for ledger we have the name, because we understand that name is something that everybody will require at the remote side. But it is always better to write it explicitly that you need it. Then when you need a function at a collection, say here is where I need the total. Instead of specifying the function here, compute it at the collection level, so that particular, when you are repeating on this, say you are repeating your line on ledger collection and you specify this function separately here, what will happen is it will go for a request back on the server, get the value, total it up and flush it back. Does not make sense. Compute it here. Will reduce the number of function calls to send to the server. Again, by default, the repeated lines over a period collection can be done, and you can modify this period collection and compute whatever values you want. Rather than calling it separately in that period collection, compute it within the same collection, so that the number of calls that we have to send here reduces. Using the same collection in more than one report. When same collections has to be used to different reports, probably few methods are same, few methods are different. Two things can be done. See, generally what people do is they write the collection and they write fetch and they give a huge list of comma separated methods. They get around 50 method names. But there is a possibility that report 1 might read only 15 of them out of that 50, and report 2 might need only say 30 out of that. And there could be some common methods both of them need. Rather than mentioning everything, all 50 methods in one fetch, the common methods that you need for both report can be mentioned at the collection level, and the other methods that you need for reports, specific reports, localize the collection name and fetch the values. So what will happen is, only when this report is called, these methods will fetch, and when this report is called, these methods will be fetched along with what you have specified at the collection level, the definition level. So the number of methods that you are fetching will reduce. Either you don't want to call it locally, mention two different collections and explicitly provide the fetch values. At least for report 1 only 15 methods would be called, and for report 2 only 30 methods will be called instead of 50 methods, right? So either, this is a quick tip, obviously if you even mention 50 methods, it's not going to create a problem, but what will happen is a huge list of methods are pulled which is not required for your report at all. And this is where we have a closure to our remote compliant TDLs. So let us have a quick recap of what we have here. So the attributes to make a report compatible at remote with better performance, we have prefetch object, fetch object, fetch values, fetch collection, and multi-object attribute at report. Fetch object at form and fields only when you require it, you call it. Fetch, walk, buy, compute, aggregate compute, client only, and palm bar at collection level. And an action we have modify object. Thank you, and in case of any queries, please do write to support.tallydeveloper@tallysolutions.com.